A term you'll hear all the time is three-point lighting. It's probably something that you're maybe roughly familiar with before watching this video. Maybe you're brand new and this is the first time you're hearing it. But basically it refers to the number of sources in your scene. If I say 3-point or 2-point or 1-point, I mean 3 sources or 2 sources or 1 source. I want to briefly jump into how you can use 3-point setups to your advantage and watch out for some of the really important traps. The thing is with 3-point lighting is technically you've got your key light, your most bright light, your predominant light on one side of the subject's face, then you have your fill light on the other side of the subject's face, and then you have some form of backlight. At the moment, in terms of the number of fixtures, I actually only have one fixture here. I've got some practicals behind me, which are also doubling as a bit of a backlight. I've got a little bit of an edge here. It's a very subtle edge. And then I actually just have a big sheet over here, which is bouncing back at my face. It's giving me a relatively low level. I didn't want it to be too flat. But it's helping sort of balance things out a little bit. I really highly recommend whenever you're doing some sort of 3-point setup to use your fill as some form of bounce. I'd watch out for using an actual separate fixture as a fill light. The main reason for this is watching where your shadows go. If I'm working with a key and a fill, I can run the risk of creating 2 shadows. Generally speaking, creating 2 shadows is pretty ugly, pretty undesirable, especially if you're working with harder lights. Let's say I'm working with 2 hard lights, I have a hard key and a hard fill. I'll get a shadow on this side of my nose, then I'll get a shadow on this side of my nose, which looks horrible. I can also even have a shadow on the wall and on the other side. It's a pretty ugly looking thing. I can't think of a good use case for having 2 shadows unless you're going for some sort of stylized music video perhaps. A great way of getting around this is working with really soft light and also bouncing your light. So this is already relatively soft. Maybe it would be nice to get it softer still, but then the bounce light is actually going to be softer still because it's going through a couple layers of diffusion here, and then it's getting bounced on this side of my face. 3-point lighting is good to get familiar with. Know how it works and know the roots of it, but then don't rely on it too much. Understand the place for each light. The reason why I have a key is to illuminate my face, create a little bit of shape. The reason why my key is not directly in front of the camera is so that it does have a little bit of dimension to it. If I have my key light directly in front of my camera, it will look really flat. This does have a place. You'll find beauty commercials sometimes, cosmetic commercials can have a really flat light. They use that for a different reason. They want to show off the face in a very clean and very easy to see way. I want to see a little bit of dimension. I'm a 3-dimensional person. I want to see 3 dimensions, so I can move my light off to one side. I might not want to move it too far because I'm also not creating a really heavy drama. Like I said before, upstage lighting, if I were to move this light behind me and I'm looking this way, that would be a nice upstage technique. It's probably not appropriate for this video, so I'm going to put it somewhere in between. This is roughly about 45 degrees to my camera. This can move around a little bit. It's really common for your backlight to be on the opposite side of your key light. I haven't done that today. Main reason you would want to put your backlight on the left-hand side of me here is to create separation from a side which sort of lacks a little bit of separation sometimes. I'm wearing a grey jersey and I've got a black background. There's already a lot of separation going on. I've also got some texture. I've got some C-stands over here. There's also light spilling onto the wall. I'm not too worried about me merging into the background. If I was, perhaps I'm wearing a black shirt, it's a black wall, I could run the risk of sort of just morphing into the background. I might want to consider having a little bit more dimension, a little bit more backlight on my left-hand side, create a little bit more of an edge, and then sort of help separate me from the wall a little bit better. At the moment, I've just got, a little edge along the side of me. Just keeping it simple, and that works for this setup. And as mentioned, I have just a sheet to my left-hand side, which is creating a little bit of a bounce. If I remove that beforehand, I almost have pitch black. This is just help sort of lowering the lighting ratio a little bit, help bring it a bit more appropriate for the tone of video that we're shooting. That's sort of a simple 3-point setup. You've got your key about 45 degrees in front of you. You've got a fill. Again, I'd recommend going for some sort of bounce just to make sure that you're not really dealing with too much shadow there. It's a nice soft light. And then you've got some form of backlight, maybe in the form of a kicker. commonly on the opposite side of your key, but you can break the rules. You don't have to follow anything too finely. Learn three-point lighting, but don't be tied down to it. I think a lot of learning DPs learn how to do a three-point setup, and then that's all they do for absolutely everything. It's definitely not appropriate for everything. Does it work for an interview setup? Yes, absolutely. Does it work for a dark thriller in the middle of a heavy scene? Probably not. I can't think of a good reason why. Learn the setup, but also be aware of its limitations and when you can and can't use it. If you want to recreate the setup, hopefully on screen right now you're going to see a bit of a lighting floor plan. I've got my key about 1.5 meters away from me. I've got my fill just about 1 meter away from me, and the backlight over here is about 3 meters away. They're all relatively close. Keep in mind, the closer your light is to your subject, the softer it gets. This is a principle that took me a while to wrap my head around. Doesn't make sense immediately. It's a really important thing to learn. The larger the source is relative to the subject, the softer it is. The easiest way to think of this is if you have a little torch light. It's a very small source relative to your subject. It's going to create quite a hard light. If you shine a torch into someone's face, it doesn't create a soft roll-off, it creates quite a hard shadow. However, if you bring a really large, let's say you bounce a light into a very large wall, the wall becomes your new source. Let's say you turn that torch, you bounce it at a wall, the wall becomes your new source. That's a very large source relative to your subject. That will be a really soft light. Maybe you've got frosted windows at home. If the sun ever comes through those frosted windows, they'll become the new source. You'll probably find that's a really soft light. So if you need to soften your light, think about how can you make it larger relative to your subject. So sometimes that's making your fixture larger or your modifier larger. Sometimes that's actually just moving it closer to your subject. It's quite easy to create soft lighting for a single person shot. It's quite difficult to do it for a wide shot with maybe a group of people. This is when expensive gear comes into its own, is lighting for wides. There's some really cool rigs out there where you'll put sort of floating lights or on cranes where they can light a really nice soft light for a wide scene. If you're not dealing with too much money, you might have to live with slightly harder light for your wider scene. A lot of people do it and get away with it because audiences aren't too aware sometimes. So sometimes you can get away with varying levels of light in your scene. Be careful of it, but again, to keep things simple, the larger your source is relative to your subject, the softer it will be.